Hello everybody and welcome to a JAYEMM on Cars special. I want to thank all of you who tuned into my video made last year looking at the incredible McLaren MP4, where I was fortunate enough to be joined by 3 members of the original McLaren team. I had hoped that you'd enjoy that video, and you did, with over 700,000 views and counting. However, many of you were not satisfied because you wanted more shots of the car, more detail, more stories, more everything. And I'm delighted to say, so did I, and that is what today's video is. I recently spent another day with the same team at a different location and with another MP4, this time going into even further detail about the complicated and groundbreaking engineering behind the car. This footage has been interwoven into the original piece to create a supercut of McLaren MP4 goodness, filled with as much information I could get in the time that I had. If you have recently seen the original, I've put chapters on this video to help you navigate and find all the new content. If you haven't, this video will still contain everything the first one did, so there's no need to rewatch that. Before we begin, I want to say a big thank you to some of the players who made this video happen. Firstly, to my team behind the scenes, Anthony and Damani of Sports and Touring for the first video, and Ben from Dad Cars who kindly came along for the second. Our hosts must also be given special mention, for without them we couldn't have done anything. First, we had Kiklo Spaces, who provided the filming venue and also access to chassis number 3. And to Paul Lanzante, who allowed us to film our bonus footage with chassis number 2. Paul Lanzante is a specialist firm that looks after a number of McLaren race cars and was also the force behind the famous Le Mans victory for the McLaren F1. They specialise in the restoration, repair and maintenance of historic motor vehicles, and to be given such access to the workshop is a very rare thing. I would also like to mention Derek, Johnny and all the staff there who were incredibly accommodating of us. You may note in the new footage a little bit of extra background noise. That is because we were filming in a live workshop. Most importantly, this piece would have been simply impossible without the extremely valuable contributions of our stars: Neil Trundle, McLaren veteran and chief mechanic for the 88 season, Steve Nichols, chief designer for the MP4, and Matthew Jeffries, who was project lead for the front suspension and monocoque of the car. If you enjoyed today's video and want more information on this amazing period in F1 history, you'll almost certainly enjoy my sit-down interview with Steve talking about his life and time in the sport, from IndyCar in the USA to working at McLaren and later Ferrari, then back to McLaren again. He is presently working on a new road car, the Nichols N1A. And, if you're a collector, to my mind there are few cooler pieces of F1 related art than the prints made by Matthew Jeffries. Painstakingly hand-drawn from original sketches and photographs, they are true-to-life recreations of a number of race cars exactly as competed. Many of them are signed and all are limited editions. To coincide with the release of this video, Matthew has commissioned a series of 50 prints of this car as driven by Alain Prost, signed by himself, Neil and Steve. To secure one for yourself, please contact him using the link in the description down below, and make sure to mention that you watched this video for a special discount. Neil is also now available as an after-dinner speaker, and as you'll see from this, I can think of few better people to keep a crowd entertained with anecdotes of F1's glory days. A link to his website will also be below. And so, we begin. To fully appreciate the achievements of the MP4, we have to take ourselves back in time. The world was different, and so was Formula 1. Modern-day F1 cars have grown massively in size and complexity, with a myriad of hybrid and other systems. The 2020 McLaren MCL35 was amongst the biggest cars the sport had ever seen. At over 5.4 metres long and 2 metres wide, it occupies more floor space than a Rolls-Royce Wraith. It featured numerous energy recovery systems, a paddle-shift gearbox, and aerodynamics that appear to have come from the future. The MP4 by comparison is minuscule. At 4.4 metres long, it's closer in size to a Ford Focus, and it weighs considerably less, 540 kilos without a driver, over 200 less than the current cars. 1988 was also a year of change for Formula 1. Having become dominant in the 1980s, turbo engines were now in their final season. To that end, some teams had already switched to naturally aspirated units, but others stuck with forced induction. Prior to 1988, McLaren had competed with the TAG turbo engine, as built by Porsche. However, for the new year, a deal was signed that brought two significant changes. The first, a new driver in the form of Ayrton Senna, the Brazilian who had already been making waves, first in Toleman and then Lotus, and was a hotly tipped favourite for future champion. The second was a deal with Honda, who had already been supplying engines to both Lotus and Williams. To help encourage teams to move away from turbos, the rules were tipped in favour of the naturally aspirated cars. Boost was reduced from 4 bar in 1987 to 2.5 for 88, with a loss of several hundred horsepower as a result. More of an issue was the restriction in fuel capacity. Naturally aspirated cars had 215 litres, the turbos just 150, another massive reduction on the previous year. The McLaren MP4 was always destined to be a car only for the 1988 season. Design began very late, as the Honda engine deal was not signed until August of 1987. And chief designer Steve Nichols did not want to begin major design work without knowing what engine they would have. Though a naturally aspirated V10 was already in the works at Honda, it wasn't ready for 88, and so the car was designed around the 1.5 litre Honda RA168E. By this time a mature engine, but meaning McLaren would be hindered by the tight rules for the turbo cars that year. Looking at it from a contemporary perspective, the odds were somewhat stacked against McLaren. Their engine's performance was restricted, their fuel limited, the design process started extremely late, and their veteran chief designer John Barnard had left to go to rivals Ferrari. The remaining design team was also split in two, with the 1988 car being designed by Steve Nichols and Neil Oatley beginning preliminary work on the naturally aspirated 1989 car, the MP4-5. But the relatively small McLaren team was determined to prove itself. They had experienced and talented designers, world-class engineers, and in Ron Dennis, a leader who did what it took to get the resources required. And with Prost and Senna, they now had the two best drivers in the world. The MP4 turned out not just to be a good car, but one of the most successful in motorsports history. Winning 15 out of 16 rounds that year, it proved utterly dominant, and paved the way for several years of highly competitive McLaren race cars. This video is a tribute to that car and the team at McLaren who built and raced it. We begin with the story of the first race of 1988.
Wow, this is a bit special. This is the 88 15 out of 16 winning car. This was the car that Senna drove in Brazil, and it was a fraught time to get it there. In fact, this chassis arrived, this was the spare car, arrived in pieces. We'd worked day and night to get there. It was all a bit late, but that was nothing unusual. I think we were confident because the car was quick in testing, but only we knew just how quick it was, I think. So we arrived in Brazil. Mechanics started to assemble the spare car. Two cars were more or less complete, the Senna and the Prost car. This is chassis 3, which was in pieces. Came to first practice. By then we had 3 cars. In those days you had 2 race cars and you had a T car sitting there ready to go. The rules were, during that season, between the 2 drivers, that they randomly selected, so it was 16 races, they randomly selected which race they had priority use of the T-car. I mean, it was available for the other driver, but they had prior call on it during practice. And often, they would choose the spare car as their race car. Yeah, this was Prost car, chassis 3. So they were running around in practice. Suddenly, Prost came in the pits, and the whole nose assembly was dragging on the ground, which was a bit of a shock. So we took the nose off, and the Nosebox was also hanging on the ground. And what had happened was that the whole front bulkhead, well, the top part of the bulkhead, had become delaminated, not from design. There was an error back at the workshop. In the panic, there was an error in fitting the Nosebox, and the bulkhead had been, or the front of the car had been filed away to fit the nose, and it took away the outer layer of carbon, and the whole top of the front bulkhead peeled off, and the nose was on the ground. That was a bit of an alarm call. We looked at the other cars. They weren't as bad. Prost took over another chassis. We did a repair on this. We did a resin repair, and we put some reinforcing rods on this car. Come the race, they went round on the parade lap, came to the grid, and switched off the engines. We went out to the cars, did a few little adjustments, and then started them up for the lap to the grid. There was the countdown. Senna was sitting there, and as he put it in gear, suddenly he was waving his arms, and what had happened was that the gear shifter had lightning hole up the inside, quite a big hole, and it had been drilled too far, and at that point it parted company and he had no gear change. So he was waving his arms. Ron Dennis and Barry Oldham ran out, climbed over the barrier and tried to fix the car. Meanwhile, all the engines are running. The starter is waiting to start the race, and then the marshal said, leave it, you've got to get off. So Ron and Barry jumped back over, the car was wheeled away. Meanwhile, Ayrton ran to the pits to get in the spare car. The cars went off and Senna left at about 30 seconds after the start. Within a few laps, of course, he was up with the back markers and he was climbing through the field, but they decided that he had started after the race had officially started, so they black flagged him, which was a shame. Yeah, that was a bit of a drama. Prost won the race quite easily, and that was one Brazilian home Grand Prix that Senna missed. He missed quite a few. I think it wasn't until '91 that he got his home Grand Prix win. He was devastated, so were the crowd. The car performed well, the engine was fantastic, and yeah, first of many.
Okay, well this is the MP4 from 1988. And if I could just tell you a little bit about the external features and some of the differences between it and its predecessor, the MP4 You can see that the nose is a similar shape, but just much narrower. The monocoque, even from the beginning, you can see is a squarer shape, bigger sectional area, so it's stiffer. We had a rule then that the driver's feet had to be behind the front axle. It made the packaging of the front somewhat difficult. You've got to fit in the dampers and the driver's feet, and so the chassis tapers out and becomes bigger as it goes back. So we mounted the dampers vertically in this area, and the pull rod is angled back. So we had more room for the driver's feet here, and then slightly further back the dampers. This car is the MP4 with the TAG turbo engine that Porsche built, and these were the cars that we raced in '84, '85 and '86. Even though this car had a flat bottom, we had retained this sort of trapezoidal shaped monocoque, which was narrower and made room for the ground effects type of shaped floor that we had at the time. This is quite a big difference now. When we go to the MP4, there was really no need anymore for having that skinny trapezoidal sort of shape to the monocoque, and we could make the chassis much stiffer by making it square-sided instead of this sort of trapezoidal shape. So you can see now on the MP4, its sides are vertical. So it dramatically increases the sectional area of the monocoque and makes it stiffer. And in fact, from memory, this chassis was about twice as stiff as the MP4 chassis was. And the other thing it did is, when you come back to the fuel tank area, you can't see it really because all the intercooler ducting is in the way. But the sides of the monocoque in that area are vertical as well. And what that means is, instead of having the trapezoidal shape, you've got these vertical sides, so it means more fuel down low, which gives you a lower center of gravity. So in addition to being much stiffer, it also gave a lower center of gravity for the fuel.
Well, here we are with chassis 2. This particular chassis was raced by Prost eventually after the problems with chassis 3 in Brazil, and this is the chassis he won with. It went on to be a car that Ayrton drove, and he won in Canada and the USA with it. But it's also the car that Ayrton was driving in Japan when he won the World Championship. So it's really high provenance car, this one. So the monocoque represents the bit, obviously, that the driver sits in, and the nose box goes on the front, and it extends right the way back past the fuel tank to where the engine bolt's on. So that, when we talk about chassis numbers, it's that particular unique piece which is really the chassis.
just to show you a little more of the evolution of these cars. This is the MP4-2, and you can see here it's got quite a narrow-based wishbone, and it's got a pushrod suspension with a rocker. Now, the previous cars, that had just been the kind of old-fashioned rocker, you know, where there was a pivot there and the damper mounted on the other end of the rocker. We changed over to this system because we wanted this sort of nodding donkey type arrangement, because with the arrangement sort of a bell crank like that, you could introduce rising rate into the front suspension. Now, rising rate means that due to the geometry of this arrangement, as the car pitches, the effective wheel rate increases. Effectively, the spring rate becomes stiffer, the wheel rate actually, but you see what I mean. And that helped to control the pitching of the car and help to accommodate any pitch sensitivity that we had due to the aerodynamics. One disadvantage of this was that we'd fit this narrow-based wishbone into the same space as the rocker, so yeah, it's quite narrow, which is less than ideal. Now, there are a couple little things to talk about. You know, we've talked about the brakes. You can see here the assembly of the brakes with the two calipers and the carbon disc. And the other thing you can see, the axis here between the track rod and the upper pivot there, and those two intersect just about at the rear axle line, which gives it normal positive Ackerman. Now, continuing the evolution, if we look at the MP44, the brakes aren't on this car, but we had copied over the calipers and the braking system from the MP42 to the 3 and then to the 4. And you can see here we've gone to a wider based wishbone. And now the other interesting feature here, we'd done testing with Ackerman. Now, Ackerman it's in the suspension geometry. Most of you, I'm sure, are already aware, but it turns the inside wheel more than the outside wheel, so that the radii of the inside and the outside wheel are much the same, so that you're not scrubbing one of the wheels. Now, this is another thing that's carried over through the history of McLaren. We first tested anti-Ackerman in the early 80s with Niki Lauda. I had this theory that I have to go into a little bit of technical detail here, but tires have a so-called slip angle. And this slip angle, what it means is when you load up a tire in the corner, it generates a torsional load, a twisting load in the tire. And so the contact patch doesn't turn as much as the wheel does. So there's this angle between where the contact patch is and where the wheel is, and that angle is the so-called slip angle. Well, my theory was that that's fine for Granny in her little car in a supermarket car park doing 2 miles an hour. But on a race car, you corner at high speeds and you generate big lateral acceleration loads. And so the outside tire, there's a lot of load transfer, and the outside tire has a lot more load and the inside tire less. So that you put more load in there and it generates a greater slip angle. So you've got a much greater slip angle in the outside tire than you do in the inside tire. And especially the way these tires were in these days, you know, we had the 13-inch rims and really quite tall sidewalls. So there was a lot of distance there that you could generate this twist or generate bigger slip angles. So what I was trying to do is get the tires pointed at the right radius rather than the wheels. So my theory was that the difference in slip angle inside and outside tires generated automatic Ackerman, so to speak. So we did this sort of Ackerman, anti-Ackerman, where the axis here intersects maybe one car length in front of the car. So when we tested this with Lauda, we started off with the standard Ackerman, intersecting to the rear. Then we did parallel, so no Ackerman, and he liked that better. And then we tried anti-Ackerman, and he was even more favorably impressed with that. So it kind of vindicated the theory that I'd had, and was a small improvement in our suspension geometry. Another thing to look at here is these uprights, I think, are They're very elegant uprights, fabricated 4130 steel. These were an invention of John Barnard in the late 70s. And the bearings are mounted in this cylindrical steel piece here, and then there's another sort of stepped cylinder the outside of that, and then these webs or spokes connect the two. So then you've got the brake duct here, which enters from this side and goes through the upright and comes out through these openings to cool the brake disc. And also these hubs or stub axles are hollow, so air comes out through the middle and helps to cool the bearing. So very elegant design. And all of the mountings for the brakes and the steering and upper and lower wishbones, and that's all done out of thin, I think from memory, that all of that's made out of 20 gauge steel. So they're very light, very strong. I'm not sure that anybody's made more elegant uprights than that. This is another little interesting feature. On the end of the wishbone, we have this titanium housing, and it has a spherical bearing swedged into it instead of the traditional rod end. And then we put spacers in here to adjust the camber rather than winding the rod end in and out.
So the front wing on the 4.4 was a slight deviation from the previous year because the main plane was actually a one-piece structure that went through the nosebox, located it on jaws, which takes the main plane aero load and drag such that the resultant vector went through the corner of the jaw, which gave it very good location and stability. And the nosebox is carbon fibre, which was the first carbon fibre nosebox McLaren did. Now, the nosebox does two jobs. It's a crash structure, which has to comply, and it has to comply with a physical crash test that we had to perform. But it also carries the main loads from the front wing. The regulations stipulated that you had to crash this at 30 miles an hour, which doesn't sound much, but it's hitting something which is immovable, a solid wall. We had to ensure that the average deceleration was no greater than 25 G, and there was no damage in effect ahead of the driver's feet, which would be around about here on the monocoque. They're quite difficult rules to comply with, and being the first carbon fibre nosebox that we did, we had to learn all about the crash worthiness of carbon fibre and the energy absorption characteristics of carbon fibre. And what we did was to learn through the use of our own drop tower that we developed, which was essentially a 10 metre, 30 foot structure where we would hoist the nosebox with 780 kilograms of steel plates behind it up in the air, and then release it in such a way that as it hit the ground it would be travelling at 30 miles an hour, and observe the results. It was an interesting process. We built many of these as research and development projects to see what happened, and finally arrived at a solution that you can see here. And I should point out, by the way, also that this particular nosebox has got a hole in the front and two slots on the side here, which are non-standard, and they weren't in period, shall we say. They've been added for another reason for the cars as they're currently running, but that's probably an important feature to point out. Looking inside the nosebox, you can see that there are, it's essentially two skins with aluminium core, but there are also these top hat sections which are stiffeners, but also designed to crunch up in a way that absorbs the right amount of energy and also prevents the deformation occurring beyond a certain distance. So typically when we crashed one of these, the nosebox would be destroyed to about this point here. We also found, interestingly, to get carbon fibre to work well as an energy absorption material, it was beneficial to keep the fibres fairly high modulus. In other words, they're very stiff, very brittle. And the reason for that is we learnt that in the energy absorbing process, the more that the fibre could buckle and break and effectively turn to dust, the more energy you could absorb from it.
Very early on in 1981, we'd done this carbon monocoque. And one thing we weren't sure about was how crash-worthy it would be and how much energy it would absorb in a crash. So we stuck to an aluminium nosebox, thinking that it could absorb more energy. And so to try to improve its energy absorption, we'd put these additional bulkheads in here so that more aluminium to crush up. Now, interestingly, there's some flanged holes in that bulkhead, and I'd put quite a lot of effort into because there's the clutch master cylinder is very close to that bulkhead. So I had made sure that the flanged hole was just barely big enough so that you could still unscrew the lid and there would be clearance because of that flanged hole. And it was quite interesting because when we bolted all the car together and Ron saw that master cylinder and the close clearance on the flanged hole, he immediately went down and he unscrewed the lid, and of course it just barely came out as I had laid it out. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, that was lucky."
So not long after I joined McLaren full-time, in 1984, after I graduated, John Barnard asked me to have a look at the new nosebox that was required for 85. This is it on the MP4 2B. And the main difference compared with the previous year's car, the 2, is that the new regulations came in that required us to perform a physical crash test. And just for the hell of it, we thought we'd try where we currently were with the 84 nosebox. And it flattened the whole thing to within literally about an inch of the whole thing. So much so that virtually no energy was absorbed, and it cracked the concrete block of our drop tower. So much to the consternation of everybody, we thought, okay, we've got to rebuild the drop tower and we've got to redesign the nosebox. Outwardly, it has the same dimensions, but inwardly it's very different. You can see there's some obvious differences with the lightning holes here in the sides. One of the reasons is that there's a big stiffener now on the inside face where previously there'd been a hole. But more importantly, what we did to pass the test was to double skin a big U section which ran all the way back to the front bulkhead of the monocoque. And in that U section, we had made castellated, we call them Kit Kats actually, because they're very similar to the well-known chocolate bar in section. And those shapes run longitudinally, and in much the same way that a Coca-Cola can or there are other soft drinks available that crush when you stamp on them, it had the same effect. So these top hat sections trapped within the skins crumpled up, concertinaed up, and absorbed all the energy. And that goes for the floor and for these two inner side panels. On the bottom edge of the end plates, there's what looks like a wooden strip, and it is, in fact, a laminated wooden strip called Jabrock, with a Kevlar hinge, in effect, between the wooden strip and the carbon fibre main structural part of the end plate. That was designed so that if it hit the curbs, it had a degree of flexibility. In those days, you're not allowed to have movable aerodynamic devices, of course, but this was deemed such that it was just a stiffness issue, and it was allowed.
The side pods were quite low. They're pretty much identical to the side pods that we had on the MP4-3. The whole engine cover area is a bit lower than the 4.3. The Honda engine was more compact, and the fuel tank had gone down to 150 liters, so the fuel tank was smaller, the engine was smaller, and so the center part of the car is lower than the 4.3. We wanted to fit the driver into the same profile as the fuel tank and the engine, so the driver was reclined a little bit more than on the 4.3 to get his shoulders down in the same profile as the engine and the fuel tank. The so-called Coca-Cola shape was the same as on the 4.3. There's it's quite an abrupt shape there. And that was because there's a turbocharger in there, so we needed to have the bodywork go around the turbocharger. We could get away with quite a sharp radius there because the tire forces the air to go inboard of the tire and then up the top surface of the diffuser, and diverting that air through there tends to fill the hole in the air behind the car. The rear suspension, quite similar to the 4.3, it's got a push rod compared to the pull rod on the front. You can see a little duct there for the gearbox oil cooler. Rear wing is mounted to the gearbox with these twin carbon plates to support it. The end plate's quite big, quite rectangular. We needed a degree of flexibility between the diffuser and the end plates, but we didn't want them flapping around. So there's a tongue at the bottom of the end plate which fits into a little slot on the diffuser, which keeps the end plate from flapping around too much, but introduces a degree of flexibility between the end plate and the floor. And then the exhaust comes out either side into the diffuser area. So that's about it from what you can see externally.
So tyres, all the teams were running Goodyear tyres, but it's interesting to note that in this period, qualifying was qualifying tyres. When we talk about qualifying tyres, we mean tyres that are super sticky, a slow warm-up and then one fast lap, to the point where when they come in the garage, they are like glue. We were talking earlier that until we got the trick of unsticking them from the floor when the cars had come in, until that point, often they come in from qualifying, stop in the garage, and generally the mechanics immediately lift the front of the car up. Well, we've got pull rod suspension. So if the tyres are stuck to the garage floor, when you lift the car, the pull rod was put into compression and the thing would bend like a banana and it would scrap the pull rod. So we'd have to change them. We soon twigged that, so we'd either put water on the floor or we'd roll the car backwards and forwards to unstick them before we jack them up. All teams had qualifying tyres. We had different compounds of tyres, not like modern Formula One where the tyre choice is restricted. You could run a mix of compounds if you wanted around the car for the race. So we had this pull rod suspension, which was rising rate, which Steve introduced on this car. It was a great system, worked very well. There wasn't a limit on the number of tyres, unlike now. So every session was a new set of tyres from Goodyear. And of course, in the race, you had the choice of how many. You could stop 4 times if you wanted in the race. But and Goodyear did a good job on the tyres. Practice and qualifying, same set of brakes, and then a fresh set of pads for the race. Same calipers, suspension. You know, that did the whole weekend. Steel track rods, very lightweight. I think they could take a bit more impact than carbon ones now. That's my personal view. So the brakes. These are carbon brakes, and the carbon brakes have been around for a few years. But these calipers, we'd had them at McLaren's over a few years with our cars. They were designed and manufactured by McLaren. For a few years we did our own design until we got an outside brake company to supply a caliper. Because of low engine deceleration, because it's a small turbo engine, I think Steve and the designers decided that we needed 2 calipers on each corner. So we had 8 calipers. The brake ducts, they look very simple now, but they worked fine, and you could control the cooling of the ducts just simply by taping. You had to get it right for the race, but we would adjust it by altering how much air went in.
In the early 80s, we didn't like the cast aluminum calipers that we had. We wanted something that was stiffer and lighter, and so we started machining our own calipers, as you can see here. So they were done in 2 halves, and then we had this block in the middle that completed the assembly. We were running carbon brakes, and so temperature control was quite an important factor. So I'd made these little titanium inserts that go in the end of the pistons. I use titanium because the heat transfer coefficient is better than either steel or aluminium, so it transmits less heat. And then I cut these little slots in it so that there was just these tiny little bits of titanium left, just the minimum amount that was required to handle the compressive loads, and less material meant that less heat would be transferred through. And then because we had all these slots, we were able to put vent a little air through there from the brake ducts. So that was quite an improvement on the brake calipers, and started a bit of a trend. And now they have even more sophisticated calipers where Brembo and AP and people like that are able to do the whole thing in one piece instead of the two halves bolted together. Now the other half of that brake package are these carbon discs. Now this is another carryover from an earlier era. Once again, we did these carbon discs in the early 80s along with these calipers, and because of the extreme heat generated by the carbon discs, created the need for these titanium inserts to try to keep the heat away from the brake fluid. So they were the carbon discs, and they had venting holes, as you can see, and the disc bell itself was aluminium, hard anodized. We had to get these special high temperature bolts. And then there's these little bobbins that are made out of titanium because of their heat transfer characteristics. And you can see there's a little bit of slop there so that the disc can be slightly self-aligning to avoid vibrations. So yeah, that was an interesting concept from the early 80s, which was carried over into the MP4-4.
It's worth looking at the wheel nuts on this period of cars. So compare with modern Formula One cars and pit stops. I mean, we changed tyres during the race. They'd seldom go the whole race. So it was very simple. It's a hexagonal nut. The wheel is located with pegs, but it's a simple hexagonal nut. So the mechanic has actually got to find the hex. It's also, by regulation, has to have a safety peg in case the wheel comes loose to stop the wheel nut coming off. So this is a process that the mechanic's very involved in. Nowadays, as the car comes in, they literally on and off, and the nut is retained in the wheel that's going on. So here, the mechanic has actually got to undo the tab, gun it off, gun the nut on, and put the peg back in. So inevitably, it's going to take longer, but actually we could achieve pit stops in, it's not the 2.2 seconds they do now. I think our fastest was in Spain. I think we did a 4 or 5 second stop. I mean, the guys were good and fast, but it's a longer process. Same process as now, really. 3 on each wheel. A gun guy, one taking the wheel off, one putting the wheel on, a front jack man and a rear jack man, and also what we call the lollipop man. So this was generally Ron Dennis, who stood at the front with a lollipop, and when he saw that all the wheels are on, he released the car. Probably a bit more reliable than nowadays, goes wrong. So very simple, but it worked. I have to say that the whole car was easy to maintain. The design made them very user-friendly. Subsequent races, we generally had 4 cars. So we'd have 2 race cars, the regular T car on the ground, ready to go, and often we had a spare chassis in a box, part assembled with all its wiring looms, no suspension for emergency. 3 cars on the ground, 3 mechanics on each car. So you had number 1 on each car and 2 number 2s. And they stayed with those cars. We had the most fantastic crew in '88. 100% dedicated, could go without sleep for 2 days if necessary, but they were brilliant mechanics. In the evenings, we'd all go out together. So 3 on each car. Me as chief mechanic. We had a guy that looked after the tyre logistics, fuel guy, travelling fabricator to do any repairs. That was about it. We were a small team.
When you think about how it all comes to be, the design process, first of all, you've got to consider the rules and the components that you have to work with, what engine you're going to have, people that you have to work with, trying to apply all the brain power to the task. So it starts off just a thought process. What do we want to do? How can we build the best possible car? And from there, you have some ideas, and then maybe you do a few sketches. Matthew is very good at doing sort of 3D sketches of how things could possibly be. Then you go into more detail with layouts, laying out the whole concept of the car on the drawing board, and then you can carry on from that to start doing all the detailed design. I often wonder if that wasn't a mistake. Should we have proceeded further down the design path with the TAG turbo Porsche engine? But in the end, I suppose it was right to wait, and so that we could have a better, complete, integrated design with the chassis and the engine. I think if we'd have got further down the Porsche TAG turbo route, then we would have been sort of adapting to the Honda engine, and it wouldn't perhaps be as idealized. It did make it late, and I was well aware that it put everybody else, we're the beginning of the process, and it put everybody else late to build the car, to test the car, to get it to Brazil. I suppose the whole thing was 8 months from the very beginning of the thought processes to being on the track in Imola.
So Steve, there were 17 of us under you as the chief designer. I was assigned responsibilities for the sort of forward part of the monocoque and nosebox and the front suspension in terms of the layout and the detail design. But then we had some really great people. We had David North, of course, doing the gearbox, David Nielsen on the rear suspension, Hugh Moran, often overlooked, but a great Kiwi engineer who, with a little Hewlett-Packard calculator, managed to work out all the angles and hard points of the drop-in piece for the cockpit, which we'll talk about at some point.
That was incredibly difficult to make that all fit the two pieces together. So Huey did a great job there.
Here we are, guys, at the back of the car. We've got to look at some detail here. Let's talk about the rear wing and adjustability of downforce, fast to slow circuits.
Well, the circuits through the year are very different. A place like Monaco, Hungary, you'd want maximum downforce, biggest wing, that sort of thing. And places like Monza, then you'd want to minimize that. So we had 2 or 3 different sizes of rear wing. And then the flap here is adjustable. You can see on this one there's 3 positions, so you can increase the angle of attack of the flap to adjust the downforce there. And also you see there's holes in the flap here where we could bolt on different sizes of the so-called gurney flap to further increase the adjustment range of the rear wing. So yeah, it was a matter of optimizing the amount of downforce there to suit the particular circuit that we were at the time.
And the other thing I remember, such was the aero load pushing in the M fences because of the low pressure. These things would bend under, and then you came up with this design. Yeah. And I remember we had it bolted permanently, but it would break this off.
Yeah, sure.
So then we made this little adjustable slider, which was...
So it keeps the wing from flapping around,
stops
the end plate
them bending in, yeah.
The funny thing about that, though, Neil,
flexibility there for
the funny thing about that, it was not carried over on the following year's car, on the 5.
That's true.
And I'm never quite sure why Neil didn't...
Maybe the M fences were stiffer.
Well, I think they were largely the same, but I'll have to go back.
And you've even got a wicker bill going flat on here to increase the difference of pressure.
Well, it helps a little bit with the stiffness of the end plate, but also it gives you a little more
difference of
suction, so to speak, to pull the air around the corner.
So we had 3, I think, an R1, R2 and R3 they were called, weren't they?
Yeah.
This was the R3, I think, the lowest downforce option. But to change it, you unbolt it and change the whole unit.
Yeah, change the whole unit. And it was easy to use. And we had, for simplicity and recognition, remember we had a colour coding, paint colour coding, orange, yellow and blue of the different options. So that we always knew we got the right combination. I'll tell you a funny story about the back end of this. The regulation after the race, scrutineering and any time during scrutineering, one of the requirements was you had to be able to engage reverse. Well, we used to get so much wind up on the gear shift that it wouldn't quite take it far enough at the back, and so the scrutineer would be at the front with Gary, and he'd be showing them to engage, and one of us at the back would sneak a spanner on and just give it the tweaks.
Well, because you can imagine that you see
the wind up on
there's a gear shift there, and there's that linkage in between, which is all fairly small tubes, and you just get that torsional wind up.
That was at Ricard with Prost and Senna. They were dicing with 10 laps to go. I didn't know who was going to win, and the nut came undone. The lock nut, and Senna lost the sideways movement. And thereafter we put a lock tab on it.
To make sure that it couldn't
So the last thing he did before the race was make sure he was happy with it and bang the lock tab over.
So the front wing was also had a range of adjustment so that we could have low downforce at places like Monza and high downforce at Monaco or Hungary. So you can see there's holes across the flap here, so we could put the gurney flaps on there or take them off for more and less downforce. And then you see here there's a number of holes there to adjust the angle of attack of the flap, and they're in very fine increments really, so that you had to have 3 rows of holes, because if you tried to do them all in one row they would run into each other and you just have a slot. Now I remember one time Ayrton had some high-speed understeer and he wanted an adjustment, so I said, well, we'll add one more hole of flap, and he said, no, it's too much. And I said, well, we'll just raise one flap on one side, not do the other side. And he said, no, that's still too much. So I said, okay, we'll move it up one hole, but I'll get the mechanics to slot that hole so that we can move it down a little bit more, and effectively it'll be a half a hole on one side. And he said, yeah, okay, that'll be good. He was that sensitive, that he could feel these tiny little aero adjustments. And even on things like tire pressure, I'd arrive on the grid. He used to like to do 3 laps through the pits before the start of the race to get some temperature into the tire, and he'd arrive on the grid and he'd want me to adjust the tire pressure by 1/4 of a PSI, which probably made no difference, but it made him feel happy and gave him a bit more confidence. So extremely sensitive to the adjustments on the car. Just from an aesthetic point of view, I was keen to maintain a family resemblance, so to speak, and make it look like a McLaren. So it's still kind of a chisel-shaped nose.
I'm sure it made no difference to you, but I can remember you really agonising over the exact radius that you wanted on the tip of the nose.
I know.
It's daft. It sounds daft now, but
I know it was a nightmare, but I did kind of want it like I wanted it. So then, just carrying on a little bit, we had the little windscreen here, and you can see that it's like 2 shapes. There's a shape here, and then there's this additional shape there. And we wanted to carry that line through. A lot of times you get a car and there's a shape here and a shape there, and it's kind of like connect the dots. And I wanted it to sort of flow from one end to the other. So that same shape carries right through. So you've got those 2 shapes again here, and then they blend out there, kind of like a teardrop shape behind the driver's head. So I had to rely on Matthew with his artistic skills to do these little sketches and come up with the shape, and then our manufacturing people were able to turn that into the beautiful shape.
And Colin Smith, of course, who did all the bodywork sections. I mean, he was sort of tearing his hair out a bit in terms of because you've obviously got hard points to miss underneath, but to get exactly what you wanted.
But I think the way we did that is Colin did all those sections every 100 millimeters, or when there was a little more detail, maybe every 50 millimeters. And then wasn't it Emlyn Hughes that had to...
Down on the buck.
Yeah, so he had to do this wooden shape. He had that special sort of soft, fine-grained wood, and it was quite impressive, I thought, because you could go there and you could just run your hand over the shape of that wooden buck, and it's amazing what you can feel. And it'd be just a little wobble, and he'd smooth that out, and you could make it just perfect with those hand techniques, so to speak. Later on, I know when we got into surfacing, and our CAD jockeys would do all these surfaces, and there'd be various surfaces that they have to knit them together, and you'd look at it on the screen and you'd think, yeah, that's good. And then they'd machine it. So it's done on CAD, machined on CAM, and you've got this huge lump of tooling block. And you'd run your hand over it and you'd think, there's a little wiggle there. Yeah. And it would be where they'd knitted two surfaces together, and it just wasn't quite perfect in the digital world. And then we'd have to, sort of apply that little bit of hand fettling to make it just perfect.
So I remember, Steve, you had a good idea of, once you knew the engine, obviously we knew the fuel capacity, you wanted to change the monocoque to go away from the V shape that we used to have to a more flat-sided shape, so the fuel center of gravity came down a bit. And then our job was to take your ideas and scheme them out. So I can remember my wonder scheme that I called it, of this section of the car. And from that, we detailed on the drawing board, not on CAD in 87, 88, but we detailed the various concepts as schemes just to make sure everything was going to fit in.
I wanted to do things a little bit differently in that era of the MP4-3 and the MP4-4. We'd been pretty tightly controlled by John Barnard in the previous years, and now it was our chance to do something of our own. And I was aware that I didn't want to restrict everybody to exactly my ideas. I wanted everybody to contribute. I used to be quite self-critical, but I would also encourage everybody to criticize my ideas. When we'd get to the position where nobody could come up with some reasons why it wouldn't work, then it gave me confidence that it would work. My job, more than anything, was to try to integrate all of the ideas into a whole to get the right compromise of everything, so to speak.
There were 17 of us, but we all really got on well together. We were a proper team.
It was really quite good. At the time we were just a bunch of nobodies, and we all liked each other, respected each other, worked well together, and this, to me, was the ultimate expression of teamwork, and everybody could feel invested in the car. Just to give you a little background about how these cars are made, if I can go right back to the very early 80s when we did the very first carbon fiber monocoque. We'd done a deal with Hercules in America. I had worked at Hercules straight out of university, and we went to them to get the carbon components made. It was very leading edge and very visionary of John Barnard to take the risk and attempt to make a whole monocoque out of carbon fiber. So the initial parts of the monocoque, the main shell and the bulkheads that went inside that shell to make it a complete monocoque, were laminated by Hercules in Salt Lake City. And then they would send those parts to us, and we would bond them all together to form the completed monocoque. Later, the next stage of our development in the manufacturing of these monocoques, Hercules would supply us with all the carbon fiber materials, the pre-preg unidirectional carbon, things like that, the resins and the fibers, and then we would laminate those components ourselves. In the beginning, we didn't have an autoclave, so that we would assemble the whole thing on the mold, and it would be all vac bagged and prepared to go into an autoclave, and then we would load that into a trailer with a vacuum pump to keep the vacuum on the monocoque while it was transported down to the south coast, and we used somebody else's autoclave to cook the thing. Then later, quite soon after that, in fact, we managed to buy and install our own autoclave, and then we could do all those processes ourselves. But Hercules were still a sponsor and still provided us with all the raw materials to do the lamination. More and more the car became carbon fiber. This one, monocoque's carbon, the bodywork's all carbon, the wings are all carbon, and of course, later on, even all the suspension was carbon, and gearbox case was carbon. So it was the beginning of a process starting in 1981. And now, the cars you see, they're almost all carbon, it seems like. One interesting detail that changed over the course of the season, initially the car had a snorkel in this area for the air inlet for the turbo, so there's a turbo either side, and Huey Moran had done this fairly complex shape to have a sort of trapezoidal shaped air inlet here that would then morph into a round shape where it went into the turbo. For the Silverstone Grand Prix in July, we changed to a system where we eliminated that snorkel, and the air would enter through the radiator inlet duct here. Just a bit simpler. The car looks better without those snorkels, and it reduces the drag by a minuscule amount, I suppose. But it was, yeah, one of the nice detailed changes that happened through the course of the year. The cars are obviously the Marlboro red and white. It's called Rocket Red, and it's kind of a day-glow red. It's quite a special paint. And to have it come out that color, you first have to paint the whole car white, and then the red has to go on over the white undercoat, so to speak, to come out the right color. So it's completely white, and then the red on top of that, so that's extra paint. And then you have to have a ultraviolet resistant clear coat that goes on top of that. So that's another coat of paint that goes on, you know. So the entire paint job is probably 7 kilos, you know, which I'm always probably overly insistent on the car being lightweight. So 7 kilos of paint is really quite irritating.
I guess Ron overruled you.
Well, yeah, absolutely, obviously. Ron wanted the cars perfect every race. So George had to paint the car in between every race. I wanted the cars as light as possible, so I didn't want multiple layers of paint. So I'm insisting that George strip the car back to bare carbon between every race because Ron wants it repainted between every race. And of course what George used to say to me is, look, you can't rush the chemicals. It takes a certain amount of time to dry. And of course, you know, the cars come back from a race, maybe they get back on Tuesday and they got to leave about 8 days later or something. He's got to strip and repaint. Yeah. So I remember once I was down with George in the paint shop, and you have to put the paint stripper on. You can't leave it very long or it attacks the resin in the carbon. And then he uses his scraper to scrape it off. And he's scraping the thing off like this, and I can see, you know, you look at it, it looks like a barber puller set. You could see red, white, red, white, red, white, where he's painted it 3 or 4 times. And I'm saying, oh, George, you're stripping it back to bare carbon every time. What's all this red, white, red, white, red, white? So yeah, that was a constant battle. I didn't get away with this one either, but I told George, look, put the stickers on the bare carbon, paint it, then peel the stickers off, and we'll have bare carbon where the Marlboro is. I thought, yeah, that's great, it saves a little bit of weight. But Ron came along and the carbon wasn't shiny enough, so we had to go back to this, and there's another ½ an ounce on the car.
Yeah, looking at this actually, I remember after Brazil, where the roll hoops were left bare, titanium, and in fact they were coated with a Teflon spray material, which I think George sourced. Anyway, to make any rubber or any debris that went on them slide off easily. But I remember going down to the factory after Brazil, and then coming in one morning, and all of a sudden all the cars had white roll hoops. And I said, George, what's happened? He said, Ron.
Ron happened.
Because the boss was down here in Brazil, and either boss or Ron wasn't happy with it, so he could sell more expensive space.
And he needed the contrast between the black boss and the white roll hoop. Yeah. I must admit it does look better white.
I think so, yeah.
But it's the highest point on the car, so it's the most important weight you can have.
And then the emergency pull handle, I remember the night of the first car build, just before it went to Imola, the all-nighter that we did, somebody said, where's the pull handle? And nobody had
Didn't exist.
So I can remember about 4 o'clock in the morning drawing something up, and then Austin going and making it, and George spraying it, and it was made in about 3 hours flat. But
well, here we have the roll hoop. This was quite a departure from the previous cars. You know, the previous cars had what you might call a traditional steel roll hoop and fabricated struts to give it support. Because this is pretty much the highest point of the car, center of gravity affects the way the car rolls and the lateral weight transfer. It's important for the bits that are high up on the car to be lightweight. So we did this fabricated titanium in version instead. So it's you can see you've got to have this bit curved around and the inner bit, and then these two radius leading and trailing edges are seam welded on and dressed off to get the finished product that you see. So it's another little mechanical work of art from our fabricating department. And as you can see, it's really lightweight. So now that we have the bodywork off, you can sort of see the air management of the car. All of the air enters here, and you can see there's the radiator here for the air to pass through. And then there's a small space here where part of the air then is ducted around and into the intercooler here. And then in between those two, around the inboard end of the radiator and then around the outboard end of the intercooler, the air for the turbo comes around that sort of S-bend and then into the turbocharger, as you can see there. So that's really the whole air management system on the car. Here's a few details on the engine. You can see the exhaust system here. The three cylinders come together there, and this goes around to the wastegate. The wastegate is there to open when there's excess exhaust pressure and you don't need the turbo boost. Here's this is a little cooling duct for the wastegate that taps into the inlet duct for the turbo. You can see the turbo there, trying to reduce the turbo lag. You can see it's a tiny little turbine there, and then quite a big compressor. So then you've got the main exhaust there, which exits out through the diffuser at the back, and then this smaller exhaust pipe is the exhaust from the wastegate itself. Another little engine detail, if you can see under here, this aluminium box is the oil cooler, and it's an intercooler, a heat exchanger. So instead of a air radiator for the oil, it's this heat exchanger, and it transfers the temperature from the oil into the water, and then the water goes through the radiators to get rid of the heat. So we have these little woven mesh screens to protect the radiator, and it was a little bit of a problem because typically the sticky rubber, the pickup would come flying off the tires and it would stick to the screens, and you'd get an overheating problem. So what we used to do is, just for the start of the race, we'd spray the screens with WD-40, and then the rubber would it wouldn't stick, it would just slide off and collect in the back somewhere. So just a tiny little detail that helped keep the car from overheating late in the race.
So because the cars are obviously running very close to the ground, we have to protect the monocoque, and we did this with the titanium skid plates, which are the very spectacular, which you can see sparking away in many of the races. During the French Grand Prix, one of the skid blocks actually came loose. I think it was probably knocked off by a curb and flew back under Ayrton's car and narrowly missed his sensitive regions as it pierced the underside of the monocoque through the floor.
Another little detail, you've got these engine mountings. They're quite a similar concept to the old Cosworth DFVs from years ago, but because they were longer, we wanted to try to make them a little stiffer. They're machined out of titanium, and they got 4 mountings, as you can see on the engine, and then there's 2 mountings there on the monocoque. And you can see how we've chamfered off the monocoque a little bit there to make room for the air from the intercooler to make its way into the induction logs there. You know, we were restricted, and so we had to run this pop-off valve here, given to us by the FIA. There have been stories in the past about people that felt that maybe Honda were maybe not exactly cheating, but exploiting the rules by trying to place the pop-off valve in an area where the pressure wasn't necessarily the same as in the rest of the inlet manifold there, and therefore we could run a little higher horsepower. It's a bit of a spurious argument because we were limited to 150 litres of fuel, so even if we could find a way to cheat the pop-off valve, we would have run out of fuel before the end of the race. So it's very much a function of trying to manage how much horsepower you could run throughout the duration of the race. We ran in the race just over 600 horsepower, maybe as much as 650 in qualifying. It was adjustable horsepower though, and you have to remember that this was a period of time where they were running normally aspirated cars and the turbo cars at the same time. The normally aspirated cars were the future, and the FIA wanted them to win, and so they had a weight advantage. They could run, I can't remember, I think 20 kilos lighter than we could. We were restricted boost pressure and 150 litres of fuel. So the rules were all stacked against us, really, and particularly in the early stage of the race, we'd have to turn the boost up a little bit to stay ahead of the normally aspirated cars, and then gradually as they would die away, the drivers could turn down the boost and with their controls on the dash, and then reduce the boost, reduce the revs, lift and coast. And the other thing the drivers had to do, because people talk about it being an economy run, but what it really meant is they were limited on horsepower, and they had to take all their speed out of the car itself, not just turn the boost up and run extra horsepower. They had to take it out of the car, and they had to take it out of themselves. So they had to be right on the limit every corner, every lap, to try to maximize the performance and finish the race on the fuel. So particularly towards the end of the race, we might be 2 laps down on the fuel. And they'd have to recover maybe over the last 10 or 15 laps. They'd have to try to recover that 2 laps of fuel in order to finish the race. So, well, we were very fortunate to have this Honda engine. It was a highly developed engine that had been running for years. It had been running with Spirit and with Williams and with Lotus. So when we received it, it was just a beautiful engine package. Generated quite adequate horsepower, and it got very good fuel economy in order to finish the race on 150 litres of fuel. Compared to our previous Tag turbo designed and built by Porsche, it was more compact, it was lower, so we were able to make the whole installation, the whole car, a bit lower and more compact. The Porsche engine was run effectively like 2 3-cylinder engines, and so it had 2 of these pop-off valves, 2 of these logs, 1 for each 3-cylinder bank, with 2 of these pop-off valves back here. So the back end of the 4.3 was more bulbous in that area because of the taller engine and the two pop-off valves.
1988 was the final year for the Honda turbo engine. Having entered Grand Prix racing in the 1960s to disastrous effect, Honda rejoined midway through 1983 as a supplier to the Spirit team. The RA16 series engines are all a 1.5 litre turbo, in keeping with the rules of the time. Many teams that year were still using a 3 litre naturally aspirated engine, with more than half of entrants using a variant of the venerable Cosworth DFV or DFY. The banning of ground effect aerodynamics and the simultaneous rise of turbos created an era of wild machinery, including the dart-shaped Brabham BT52 designed by Gordon Murray, which eschewed traditional design and favoured huge power from its 4-cylinder BMW turbo. It took Nelson Piquet to his 1983 title, but as refuelling was banned for '84, designers could no longer just throw power at the problem. Honda developed the RA16 rapidly, and at the end of 1983 they became a supplier to Williams. Reliability continued to be an issue, but in 1984 they achieved their first victory in the notorious Dallas Grand Prix of that year. By 1985 things were improving, and the engine provided victory to both Keke Rosberg and Nigel Mansell for a total of 4 wins. 1986 gifted Williams and Honda the championship. Now they were the engine to beat. For 1987, Lotus also adopted Honda Power, but with the new regulations incoming, that was the final year for the Williams-Honda collaboration. The writing was on the wall for turbo cars, so they switched to a Judd V8, eventually beginning their famous collaboration with Renault. For 1988, Lotus stayed with Honda, and as we all know, McLaren joined them too. The other teams sticking to turbocharged cars that year were Zakspeed, who struggled to qualify for most races, Arrows, who fared much better, and Osella, who did not. The other front-running team to retain a turbo engine was Ferrari. In spite of the fact it was close to retirement, Michio Kawamoto and the Honda team were determined to make the 88 version of the engine as good as it could be. The engine itself is quite unusual in some regards, being an 80-degree V6. However, much of the rest of it was actually quite conventional. The block is cast iron, but thin to reduce weight. In some cases the walls just 2 mm thick. The whole engine weighs about 146 kilos with accessories, roughly equivalent to the Cosworth DFV. The head is aluminium alloy, and the cam cover and crankcase sump are magnesium alloy. The fundamental design was similar to that of the first version introduced in 1983, but now with a renewed focus on fuel efficiency. The compression ratio was raised from 7.2 to 9.4. The bore was reduced from 92mm to 79. The stroke was 50.8. There are 4 valves per cylinder, the engine has 2 water pumps and 2 turbos. They feature ceramic turbine wheels and bearings for improved response and heat resistance. The fuel was not the pump gas of modern cars, instead a mixture of up to 84% toluene, used because of its resistance to pre-detonation. In fact, it was so resistant that Honda had a mechanism to heat the fuel in the car so that it would burn when asked. Exact numbers will vary due to the nature of racing, but a period article quotes up to 685 horsepower for the cars come the end of the season, at 12,500 RPM. That's 457 horsepower per litre. Amazing, but nothing on the previous year, where they achieved just over 1,000 horsepower from the 1.5 litre engine. Peak torque was 313 pound-foot at 10,000 RPM, that's 424 Nm, but an element highlighted by Honda was the unit's flat torque curve. Over 90% of peak torque was available from 8 to 12,000 RPM. The new engine was considerably more efficient than the old one. Honda say they achieved this by basing all of their calculations on real-world usage scenarios. They worked out that a car would be at over 90% of throttle opening for more than 40% of the race at a track like Imola, and so their math was based on making the car both powerful and efficient under these conditions. It worked. They never ran out of fuel in a time when this was common. Even now, decades later, Honda are still secretive about the many projects they worked on, so it should tell you just how proud they were that many of these numbers were sourced from an article in Motorsport magazine written back in 1990. By then, the engine was already ineligible for competition, but still, it had clearly made a permanent mark on the sport.
Relationship with Honda, and they used to send young engineers rotate through the factory for experience, and one of the young engineers messaged me back from Japan saying how he'd appreciated his experience in the UK, and now he was working far into the night to improve reliability. And at that stage we'd had 1 engine failure in testing, and they were still given it all to improve the engine reliability. Honda were fantastic in that regard. They would hit it with all the resources. You'd have a debrief and there'd be these problems, and they had so much staff, so much resource that they'd probably assign 3 or 4 engineers to each problem. And whereas we were much smaller, and it was the opposite with us. Each engineer would be assigned 3 or 4 problems. So. But it was a great experience working with Honda, and even though they were pretty much the other side of the world, we worked so well. The engine, as I say, was quite low, and this was enabled for the most part because Tilton had come up with this multi-plate carbon clutch, so a smaller diameter, which meant you could lower the whole engine. And in fact, it was so low that the gearbox was too low and the drive shaft angles weren't practical. So we had to design a new gearbox that had a third shaft, an extra pair of gears, to raise the output level up to something that was suitable for the drive shafts. And for that job, we commissioned Pete Wiseman to do the concept of the gearbox. And he worked with our engineers to come up with that concept. And then our gearbox designer, Dave North, brilliant engineer, and he did all the detailed design on that gearbox, and it performed flawlessly, really. And of course, he carried on to do the next year's car with a transverse gearbox. Lotus, using the same engine, had opted not to do that, and they tilted the engine to raise the back end of the engine up, but that sort of cut in half the advantage of having the low center of gravity of the engine, because it was partially raised up in the air at the back.
So let's talk about MP44 gearbox. This is a McLaren manufactured casing. It basically follows on from Hewland gearbox design. So this is a crash box. This is a manual box. The driver has to do all the clutch engagement, all the synchronizing with toe and heel on the throttle. So we'll go through a few parts of this gearbox. So initially, let's look at the flywheel and the clutch. I mean, we call it a flywheel. It's aluminium. It's very light. It's not like a road car. Not a lot of inertia there, but I guess the main inertia, flywheel effect, is from the clutch. So this is a 4-plate clutch, multi-plate clutch. It's a carbon clutch, carbon, same kind of material as the brakes. Carbon clutches were good for about 10 or 15 racing starts. Earlier clutches, which were sintered bronze, were good just for 2 racing starts. So these transmit a lot of power. It's a diaphragm clutch, the same as most road cars with a manual change. So aluminium carrier, but a steel diaphragm spring with a lot of pressure. The clutch release bearing is a simple roller bearing with a nose piece. So it engages, you can see the contact line where the radius of the release engages. You guys that understand all this, I mean, a lot of you, this will be basic stuff, but some people may not have ever seen a clutch apart. So the clutch release mechanism, we'll bear in mind on this transmission that the gearbox also carries the engine oil. So the lay shaft goes up through the oil tank, so you've got to have seals either end, but this is the basic hydraulic release mechanism. Very simple, obviously operated by the driver's master cylinder with the foot pedal. And so that's the release. These things on a racing start would glow red or white hot, same as the brakes. The carbon will take that. This is an AP clutch. There were other options. There were Tilton and Sack. Lots of the teams of this period with turbo engines were using this type of clutch, various forms. But with this engine, with the Honda engine, with the small diameter clutch, this was one of the secrets of the car, meant you could run the engine lower. That's why it needed a drop gear in the front of the gearbox to go from low crank center line to gearbox center line. So to drop the engine, you had to have a small clutch, and the multi-plate clutch allowed you to do that. We talked about the drop gears. So the crank and engine are low, but you want the drive shafts to be in a reasonable angle. So this was the clever drop gear. So this sits, when the box is split, this sits on the back cover there. This is effectively a drop gear and an oil pump. So it picks up the oil from the engine. It's effectively making it a dry sump gearbox. It picks up the oil and it pumps it into the oil collection area in the gearbox. But it also is the drop gear. You can see that they're a close fit around the outside, so they're effectively a gear pump. They're also ground on the surface, so there's no clearance there. The oil has to go round. This is the principle of any gear pump. So that's the casting and the gears of the drop gear we talked about. Let's look at the ratios and the gear change. That is the list of ratios that were in this gearbox. So it's a 6-speed gearbox. First gear is mainly the same. I mean, that's the start or first gear hairpin. So first gear is the same, but all the others, you have a multitude of ratios that you can change. You leave for the circuit from the factory and you know more or less the gears from the year before. Tyre diameters affect the ratios, but we're on the same tyre diameter, all the teams, and that tyre diameter stayed the same. I think it was 26 inches, stayed the same for quite a few years. So you leave the factory with the ratios you think you need. So you do first practice. Both drivers generally got the same gears in the gearbox. One driver might say then, okay, I could do with a slightly shorter gear for second gear on that corner. Top gear was a little bit long. I was not quite on the ideal rev range at the end of the straight. Because at the end of the straight, you don't want to be on the rev limiter. So you want to be in the peak power point at the end of the straight. That's top gear. All the other gears you're dividing up for the different corners. So you might change the ratios for second practice. Come the race morning, you do the warm-up, and then you put in your brand new gears and dog rings for the race. Okay, so a lot of pressure time for the mechanics and the gearbox guy. So you pull the gears out and you've got all your new gears ready. They're probably the same gears you ended up with for qualifying or final practice, unless it's raining, of course. If it's raining, it's a whole different ball game. You're not going to pull the same speed on the straight, so you might do a wet set of ratios. But if it's dry, you take the gears out, you've got all the new ones ready, all the new dog rings, you put those in, do the box up, put the oil back in, and that's it for the start of the race. You can't have made a mistake. So you put them in, you manually turn the box, the mechanic makes sure that all the gears are engaging okay manually. You might start it up on the stands with the engine running to warm the gearbox up, and the mechanic sits in and he changes the gears up on the stands, and that's it, in the race with all those new gears. Back in the day, you had ratios that you would use for half the season, say. But as we refined our reliability, the gears were lifed. Back at the factory, after a race, the gears would come out, they'd be cleaned, they'd be magnetically crack detected, and they go back in the system. But generally, for the race, brand new gears. Here's the lay shaft. There's the 6 speeds, first gear and second gear. You'll notice that those are manufactured on the shaft. They're integral with the shaft. Because to get the shaft strong enough, you can't have a hole up the inside big enough. That would make the gear very weak. So you have to make first and second integral with the shaft. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, they're all changeable. They're locked on the shaft with splines. That's the engagement. They're fixed to the shaft. This is a constant mesh gearbox, same as a road car. These racing boxes, you don't have any synchro mesh. On a road car, you've got synchro mesh, which means that the speeds are synchronized as you change gear. It's a little bronze cone. Racing boxes are dog engagement, and they've been dog engagements from back in the 60s. The reason they're dog engagements is a synchro, it's a slow gear change. I mean, we all change pretty quick on our road cars, but you're changing milliseconds here. So there's the dog, there's the gear. So the dog, there you are, it's changing between fourth and fifth there, right. So when these gears aren't being used, say it's in third gear, that dog sits in the middle. When you change gear, these are spinning and the dog slides and engages. And it locks in by a slight wedge angled engagement. It relies on the sharp corners like this. That's been used, but it's a nice shape. It locks to the gear nicely because it's got a nice wedge shape. If it loses that corner with a bad gear change, then it ends up looking like this, which is rounded. So that means the driver hasn't got the speeds synchronized. So it's a crunch change. It's a rush change. Alan Prost could do Monaco 3,000 gear changes and they'd look brand new. This is a bit of a rush change. Maybe it was a burger change. We used to call him Gear Hard Burger, not Gerhard, because he rushed the downshifts. When the driver downshifts, he's got to toe and heel the throttle and get the speed synchronized. It all happens in an instant. If you watch a video of Jimmy Clark, they did a video of his feet on the pedals and he was dancing on the pedals, changing down, blipping the throttle, getting a nice gear change. So that's the dog engagement. Very simple. This gearbox has been rebuilt and it's having some new dogs. These are the later dogs. You'll notice that they're very much narrower. They still transmit the load okay, so all the drive is through those little castellations. Those are bigger dogs, these are smaller. It means you've got more space to find that engagement. A modern racing box, this is all done by the computer on the steering wheel, the driver's flicking the switches, the hydraulics are firing the dog ring in, same deal, but a modern racing box has only got 5 dogs because the computer has to time the change. There's no clutch involved. So modern paddle shift only have 5 dogs and they're fired in hydraulically, not with any driver feel. So the computer does all the blip on the throttle, it does the throttle cut on the upshift. But here the driver's doing everything, so he's got to get it right. To enable us to have a 6-speed box, this was a McLaren innovation back in the James Hunt days. They realised that if they normally reverse gear, which is this gear, normally reverse gear sat in that position, but McLaren realised they could put 6-speed there and put reverse gear on the nuts. Normally, these would have just been nuts, left and right hand nuts, but they made the nuts the reverse gear, so it meant they could get an extra gear in, so it became a 6-speed box. All the teams followed after that. You'll also notice that this lay shaft has an aluminium support bearing in the middle, and this ties the main shaft and the lay shaft together and stops this shaft from bending. It was quite a clever idea. When the driver uses his gear lever to change gear, the gear lever is connected to the fork. The fork is made of bronze, so I mean they did wear out. They were sacrificial. You know, every couple of races put new forks. So the driver's gear change is connected by a shaft to this fork, and that slides the dog backwards and forwards. So you've got 6-speed box, you've got 3 forks. So one fork does first and second, the other third and fourth, the other fifth and sixth. That's the box. Very simple. The gears, I should also add, run on needle bearings. So this is the needle bearing. It's so early boxes were just splash lubrication, but the later boxes, and especially the McLaren MP4, they had jet feed up the inside, so the gears and the hubs were lubricated with oil up the inside through feed holes. So a very reliable box. The weak point of the box was the differential, Torsen Gleason gear differential. It was good for 1 or 2 racing starts. It worked beautifully, very competitive, very good on traction control, but the spider gears were quite weak. It was not the Achilles heel, because once you were racing, you were okay. But on the standing start, they took all the power, and occasionally they could fail. I had one fail on Ayrton's gearbox. I was chief mechanic then. I mean, I'm talking about gears because I became the gearbox shop manager for 16 years. But before that, I was chief mechanic. We had a travelling gearbox guy, but Paul Ricard, Ayrton was on the start, and the diff exploded, so he was out of the race. I mean, we tried to make it as strong as we could, but that diff stayed with us throughout the longitudinal gearbox. In '89, middle of the season, Silverstone, we went to a transverse box to get the weight forward of the axle, but it was a good box. And we can talk about the casing and the box over on the car. I guess the first thing to remind ourselves of is that chassis, engine and gearbox are structural. In other words, they take all the load. There's no rear frame. So we've got a magnesium casing. The patterns and the castings and the machining were made in-house at McLaren. It's a long box. The gears are behind the diff. The diff and back axle are in there. The lay shaft and drive comes under the diff to the gears at the back. You can see in the front here, this is the lay shaft. Bear in mind that this, as we mentioned earlier, has got drop gears in the front, so that drives drop gears to the lay shaft and then the final drive. It means that your drive shafts are running nice and level. They're not running at an extreme angle. We talked about the clutch. The clutch engages with these multi-splines. There's the clutch. It sits in there on those splines, and it sits on the flywheel, which we talked about, the aluminium flywheel. So the casing is made of magnesium, which was common, nice and light, fairly strong, not as strong as aluminium, but weight is everything on these race cars. Very tricky to machine. You can't let the swarf lay in the bottom of the machine, otherwise you end up with a big fire. Something which we might mention on the back of the engine here, this is the engine crank trigger. So this takes its timing off the flywheel. There's the flywheel, sits in there. So these are the timing lugs for the crank trigger, so that the ignition knows where it's firing. The engine oil, so the engine oil is contained in the front of the gearbox. Years ago, back in the day, race cars would have a big aluminium tank. Some of them sat over the gearbox, like a Lotus 49. Some of them had a big round tank at the back. But then, quite cleverly, I'm not sure it was Tyrrell, but one of the teams came up with the idea of having the oil tank integral at the front of the gearbox, and the lay shaft runs through. This is the swirl pot. Oil is returned from the engine, from the scavenge pump, quite high velocity, and it's directed around the outside tube. There's an inner tube which breathes the air. The outside tube separates the air from the oil, and then it drops back down into the pot. Quite a complicated bit of work in that. I think it was in '89, we went to Silverstone, and we had a massive problem. The engines were pumping all their oil out the breather, and we were nearly banned from racing because we were dumping all the oil on the track. So one car didn't have the problem. So we took the tank off, sent it back to the factory, and they cut it open, and there was a slight fault in manufacture, and the air and the oil could mix. So we sent all the tanks back, they re-welded them, and it fixed the problem. Anyway, that's the engine oil and the oil separation and breather. Gearbox oil is cooled by this little cooler. In the back of the gearbox is a little oil pump. and this is driven off a little gear on the lathe shaft. This picks the oil up out of the bottom of the gearbox, puts it through the cooler, back through the lathe shaft and hubs to feed the oil. I mentioned that reverse gear was now put on the back of the, was used on the back of the nuts on the lathe shaft and the main shaft, so the nuts are reverse gear. This is the little reverse gear engagement mechanism. This tube here, this takes oil and pumps it up the main shaft. There's also oil that feeds into the differential. So this is the rear cover, sits on there like that, and also this carries the rear wing on these mounts here. We talked about driver gear engagement with the gear lever. So the gear linkage comes through and it connects to this little universal joint here. So imagine the gear lever coming through the chassis. There's a rod supported by that little bush here. There's the final little bit of the gear shaft comes up here with a universal joint here. So when the driver is switching across from the gears, you'll see that this is the first, second rail for the gearbox. This is third, fourth. This is fifth, sixth. So when he's changing gear, he's going from first to second. First, second. Then he's going third, fourth. Then he's going fifth, sixth. Now, first and second are spring-loaded. That's because he doesn't use it very often on the track. And there's also, so this is heavily spring-loaded. There's also the final position is reverse. But so first, second, he has to load that up on the gear lever. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth is a narrow gate. So that's the simple gear mechanism. Just done with this selector arm and these rails. These rails are obviously connected to the dog rings. Also, I'll mention the drive shafts. So they're constant velocity joints. They have seals to stop the oil coming out of the gearbox because they're obviously running in the gearbox. And I'll tell you an interesting story on that, because these seals, left and right, they've got a little, the PTFE seal has got a little screw thread on it, so that when the box is running and the shafts are turning, they effectively screw the oil back into the gearbox. If you were to run the car in reverse, they would screw the oil out of the gearbox. We went to Monaco in '88 and we came to the race morning warm-up, and Ayrton went out and he came in and the whole back of the car was covered in gearbox oil. And so there was a huge panic, because between warm-up and race was about 2 hours. Huge panic, get the spare gearbox ready. Peter Metcalf, our gearbox mechanic, ran back to the truck to start getting the spare gearbox ready. And then he suddenly realised what had probably happened. The seals had been put in other way round, so on the track it was screwing all the gears, all the oil out of the gearbox. So he got on the phone, he said, "Don't take the gearbox off, I know what the problem is." So we said, "Are you sure, 100%? Yes, I know what the problem is." So he got the mechanics to take the drive shafts out, and sure enough, the seals were the wrong way round. Put new seals in, and that's how it went into the race. But so things can happen. We colour-coded them. It's red and black, left and right. I think we colour-coded them after that. So that was an interesting drama.
You know, you can see the gear shift knob here, another nice little detail from the boys in our machine shop. It's a titanium piece, very lightweight, as you can see the way it bounces around. A nice, elegant, smooth shape to protect the driver's soft hands. So it's hollow, and there's a little hemispherical shaped bit at the top. They're joined together, and then it's electron beam welded together and then dressed off so that, you know, you'd think that it's one piece, but so light because it's hollow. All this sort of attention to detail, and you can see the quite nicely machined slider there for the all these nicely machined components. Although it's that component that was machined improperly and caused Senator DNF at his own Brazilian race, which was really sad. If we look at our circuit simulation program, we know that if you can reduce the weight of the car by 10 kilograms, it's worth, on average, 0.3 of a second. Hence the extensive use of carbon fibre.
And were we down to the weight limit?
Yeah.
Without any ballast?
Yeah. Okay. So the weight was very important. The other thing that was very important to me was center of gravity. The weight of the car as you go around the corner, the force acts through the center of gravity, which is obviously some way off the ground, and that tends to make the car want to roll. And once again, from our computerized circuit simulation program, we know that if you can lower the center of gravity by just 10 millimeters, that's worth on average about 0.3 of a second per lap. So I was always dead keen on as light as possible and center of gravity, everything on the car as low as we could possibly make it. So this car ended up being quite low, and I think, as we've mentioned before, the Honda engine was lower and more compact, and that meant that we could once again lower the center of gravity. We did other things, for example, other materials. Over the years, as we've mentioned before, we machined our own calipers from billets of aluminium to improve the braking characteristics, to make the calipers stiffer so the brake pedal was firmer. In the beginning, it was just aluminium alloy, but later on, I knew that there was this very stiff, very light material called aluminium beryllium. So I wanted aluminium beryllium calipers. So we went. Our caliper supplier was AP, and I went to AP and said to them I wanted aluminium beryllium calipers, and they initially said no, they didn't want to make them, and I said, well, we can do one of three things. You can make them for us, or you can license us to make them with your drawings, or we'll just design our own. But one way or the other, we're going to have aluminium beryllium calipers. And so eventually they relented and made these calipers for us. Aluminium beryllium is not all that plentiful, supplied by Brush Wellman in America. And Ron Dennis bought every bit of aluminium beryllium in the world that's big enough to make calipers. so nobody else could have them because there was no material available. So I'd been to Bob Illman, our financial director, and said, I want this lightweight aluminium beryllium for the calipers. And within a few days, we're trying to make the car as light as possible so that we can carry more ballast and we can put the ballast down low. And at one stage, this was later than this car, but at one stage we'd got the car to where it was 70 kilos under the weight limit, so we were carrying 70 kilos of ballast. And lead was just way too light and took up too much space. So, I was asking our financial director for all this expensive lightweight aluminium beryllium and also this very heavy tungsten. And he didn't quite understand, but of course you need the right material in the right place. Lightweight, stiff calipers, but compact, lightweight tungsten ballast.
One interesting story which caused us a little bit of grief, to say the least, just probably a week before the car was due to run at Imola, Ray Rowe, also known as Tex, who had been one of Bruce's originals back in the early 60s and was still with us and still is with McLaren from time to time, walked into the drawing office, as he sometimes did, with the rack and pinion assembly in his hands, and he was just twiddling the pinion and the rack, watching the rack going in and out. And I was in Steve's office with Steve, and Tex sidles up to us and says, I've been playing with this for half an hour now, and I'm pretty sure that when the driver turns right, the car's going to go left. Now, when it's only 7 days before the car's supposed to run, if that was true, and Tex being who he was and being around forever generally doesn't make that kind of mistake, we were basically pretty alarmed and panicked. So it transpired, of course, that this car, as opposed to many of the previous McLarens, has the steering rack and pinion on the front bulkhead, so that the track rods and steering arms are ahead of the front axle, which means that the pinion is on the opposite side of the rack to Tex, as he would probably previously remember it. So once we'd explained to him that that was the case, everybody was relieved that we didn't have a major disaster on our hands.
Well, let's talk about the first race, Brazil. And we said earlier that this car was in pieces when it arrived. We had all the suspension with us, and so we started assembling it. But it's worth noting that this is the car we talked about where the bulkhead fell out, and this is our trackside repair in the field. We did a carbon composite repair with Steve obviously overseeing it and approving it, but done by us mechanics. Not very pretty, but it worked. And so the process arriving at the track, this car wouldn't have had the engine in. In fact, often the engines would arrive at the circuit and we'd fit the engines at the circuit. The suspension was on, the setup was done at the factory, although we used to alter the setup at the track. There's an interesting little detail on this car, which I said to Matthew, what are these little weeny blocks down here for? So this is a little ride height datum. And
so that's what you'd use to measure the ride height?
So we had the setup wheels on the bar across the top, and with a vernier, you'd measure down to that datum, and that datum was set at the factory on the surface table to the suspension point. So all the cars, that was in exactly the right position. Fairly easy to put together. I mean, you know what they say, it's only nuts and bolts. And the mechanics are very dexterous, so just a question of assembling everything. These cars, in this period, everything, so the datums are machined, the wishbones are machined. Like these wishbones, you know, you haven't got to bend them in position, they are machined to dimensions. Everything is drawn and machined, which earlier cars, you know, one wishbone wouldn't fit another car. So everything fits nicely. So 3 guys on each car, number 1 mechanic and 2 number 2 mechanics. Number 2 mechanic, one of them would be a front end man, one of them would be a rear end man. The number 1 guy would oversee, but the number 1 guy would generally do all the in-tank fuel system. You know, the hatch would come off, the fuel bags, all the pumps, he would do that part. A gearbox guy travelled with us as well, so we wouldn't change the ratios. If there was a ratio change, the mechanics would strip the back end off and put it in a tray, and then the gearbox guy would come along. Obviously the engineers had selected the ratios, and he would assemble them all in the back cover, and then we would put it back on and bolt it up. The engine was Honda's total responsibility. And we had probably 15 Honda guys at the track. So we had Goto, a top man, genius. He was the manager, director of the Honda operation. Generally, we had a Honda mechanic allocated to each car, and then we had the guys doing the data and adjustments. Process of starting the car. So, right, you've got to put the fuel in. So qualifying, you had a different fuel in qualifying to racing. So we talked about the limitation of fuel capacity, 150 litres in 88, and the turbo limit. This was to try and get equivalency with the 3.5 litre cars, but what wasn't mentioned was the rocket fuel that the turbo cars ran. There was no restriction on fuel. So we qualified with 80% toluene, I don't know if you remember that, and we raced with about 60% toluene. Toluene is oxygen generating fuel and it's rocket fuel. So with only 150 litres, we could run generally full performance throughout the race without any fuel limitation. Very dense fuel as well. Our mechanic would operate the starter. The cars are started, they don't have an onboard starter. And equally, if you spun one of these cars, you could stall it. Nowadays you've got anti-stall on Formula 1 cars. So no onboard starter. So the starter, electric starter, is plugged in the rear and it engages with the lay shaft. So our guys on the starter, the Honda guys on the throttle, and on any adjustments to the engine management, and check the oil level, which is in here. Fire it up, run it for 20 seconds, stop the engine, check the oil level, then start it again, and then warm it up. So Honda are doing all the warm-up. So Shell did, fuel, engine oil, gearbox oil, and they really did a great job for us. I mean, we all contributed, but they helped us win the championship, I think. We talked about the temperature control, so there's no thermostatic temperature control, no adjustment on the cooling, it's all preset. So the amount of air that's allowed to go through the radiator has to be decided by the engineer and the ambient temperature of the day, put that amount of blanking on and hope it doesn't get too hot. A fixed ECU, so once the chip is loaded in, programmed by Honda, that was it, that was set. In fact, so we'd run the car on the track in practice, do 4 or 5 laps, they'd come in, they'd take all their readings and lambda readings, and then they'd take the chip out, and they might have another one ready with another adjustment, put that in, and then they'd adjust the chip they've taken out. So they changed it by a chip in the ECU.
I was under Steve working on the design of the forward part, well, really from the driver forward, monocoque and nosebox and front suspension. And the design that we came up with was, because the driver's feet had to be on the front axle line, or at least behind the front axle line, which meant, in effect, on the front axle line. So the pedal faces had to be there. It determined the driving position from that point backwards. With the driver's feet on the axle line, the natural position for the dampers had been kind of in line with where the driver's feet were now positioned. So that wasn't an option. And we looked at different ideas. We looked at putting the dampers on the top, which we later did on the MP4-6, but for this car, Steve was fairly insistent that keep the mass as low as we could for all the components. We found 2 pockets whereby the spring damper assemblies could go in and sit nicely, operated by a pull rod. The pockets themselves are braced, if you like, between internal bulkheads. So from the front of the car, in a vertical direction, there's a bulkhead which comes back to the dash, and there are also 2 bulkheads going between the outside of the car, or the inside of the outside shape of the moulding, up to that vertical bulkhead. So we're really boxing those in, making it a very stiff and strong structure for the dampers to be located in. The only problem with that then was the fact that traditionally a pull rod pulls on a rocker, and the rocker, if we had one, would be right in the way of the driver's legs and the legality template. I was chatting to Dave North, who said, well, why don't you use tracks instead of a rocker? So the idea was born, and we put tracks in at the bottom. So the damper is now actually travelling on rollers in tracks.
That track prescribes the arc that a rocker would have moved in, but the rocker's no longer there. It just follows that track. So it's kind of a virtual rocker, you might say. And
then the only problem, well, not the only problem, but a problem, was the fact that a conventional anti-roll bar couldn't fit in either, because there was no space, again, in the volume that you needed for the legality template to pass through the cockpit. We came up with a slightly different solution, which you'll see in detail, but it's in effect it's the blades of the bar go across the car, and then there's a central torque tube which pivots just in front of the steering bulkhead, and it's shaped a bit like the old-fashioned lawnmower handle, so it became known as the lawnmower handle front anti-roll bar.
But the whole assembly ends up looking a bit of an H.
Yes.
You know, you've got the mountings across one end. Matthew mentions the blades. These blades were flat in one plane and sort of an elliptical shape in the other, so that as you twisted it, flat position would be soft, and then the vertical position would be hard, and that's the way you got the adjustment in the roll bar.
And then the adjuster for those blades is here, and previous to this instructions going on to the side of the car, the drivers memorized it by knowing that it was hard going in and soft coming out. Quite why they remembered it like that, I'm not sure.
It might be interesting to note about the pull rod and rising rate. Some people might not understand rising rate. This arc that I was prescribing, it would change the so-called wheel rate. You know, that has to do with the mechanical advantage that you have in the suspension. So because of the way this arc worked, as you pulled on the pull rod, the further it would go up this arc, the stiffer the front suspension would become. So that meant as the car pitched, as you braked into a corner and you pulled therefore on the pull rod, the suspension would effectively become stiffer. And this helped stabilize the car on entry to the corners, and it helped with the pitch sensitivity of the car. And inevitably the aero cylinder pressure will move somewhat as the car pitches, and by having that rising rate effect, it limited how much the car would pitch. So it became quite a strong tuning feature. That's one of the things they changed the most often to balance the car, was lengthening or shortening that. It would do quite a lot of things. If I said to the driver, well, I think I want to lower the car, increase the rising rate, reduce the gap to the bump rubber, they'd say, well, you want to do all that at once, at the same time? You know, it sounds crazy. And I'd say, well, okay, what about if we just shorten the push rod, or the pull rod? And they'd say, yeah, okay, do that.
So with the 4.4, we tried to increase the stiffness of the suspension. So we widened the wishbone mountings, which gives it a little bit more stability under braking and through subjected to the loads that it sees. The wishbones themselves with a pull rod means that, that all the vertical load carried by the wheel is pulling on this part, which means that in effect the top wishbone generally, when it's just subjected to a vertical load, is in compression, and the lower wishbone is under tension. However, there's a complicating factor in as much that under braking, then the twist of the upright causes the rear leg to go into compression. So there's a balance, different load conditions means that this particular leg had to be designed to cope with the buckling strength, if you like, or the load at which it would buckle, which is why the section is bigger. So the wishbones themselves are made from steel, 4130 steel. They are aerodynamically shaped or oval shaped. They're rolled into that shape and then further fabricated to join up in these beautifully welded assemblies. As part of the design brief from Steve was that we wanted the mountings for the upper wishbone to be as unobtrusive as possible in the airstream. I had done several iterations of the geometry, all of which this joint was somewhere like here, which was out in the airstream more than Steve was really happy with. So he said, look, can you just keep working on the geometry, retest it, see if you can get it further in? Because otherwise, with it out here, we would have had to have had fairings. You know, it's out in the airstream a bit more, so there have been fairings on the nose and the top body, which he really didn't want. So we plugged away with a very crude computer program for analysing the geometry, and we finally managed to get a position here that worked, which was just acceptable within the confines of the aerodynamic shape that he wanted. The other thing we did was on previous cars, we had these clevises were actually parallel to the ground, and we thought, well, there's no real need for that. We could actually turn them, angle them more in line with the sort of mean position of the wishbone, and actually reduce that. So we managed to package it so that it was further inboard and smaller this way. So that was quite a lot of work to make that happen, but given that it's with you forever, we're glad we did it. What we did find, however, was that it needed a small brace. Without this, would be too flexible. There's obviously a compressive load coming in here from time to time, or a tensile load, and it would, without this, flex too much. So that's what that rather crude-looking brace does.
This is the damper from the front of the MP4. So this was a new concept for the MP4. These were Showa dampers, but they were quite specialized. This is the lower mounting, and this is the attachment for the pull rod. And we've said before about how it's a system of tracks. And these two wheels would go up and down in the track and effectively simulate the path of what would have been a rocker had we had a rocker, but we did these tracks instead to allow room for the driver's legs. And then we could play around with that shape to get more or less rising rate to help in the tuning and the handling of the car. And it had there was this external reservoir, and it had there was an electronically controlled adjustment system, so the drivers could adjust the damping characteristics from the cockpit. And then this was the upper pivots where the top of the damper was attached into the chassis, and then this is the drop link that connects to the anti roll bar. So yeah, this was quite a clever system. We worked with the Showa people. We worked with the Showa people on the dampers, and I'd had quite a lot of experience with dampers in America, particularly working with the Indy cars. So there were certain characteristics of the dampers that I always tried to use. I used to like to try to control the basic balance of the car, low speed balance with springs and anti-roll bars, high speed with the wings, and then I tended to try to use the damper not so much for the overall balance of the car, but tried to use the damper to control the transients, so sort of how quickly the car would roll and how quickly it would pitch. So I had this little recipe that I used which had quite a lot of low-speed damping, the sort of things that you'd consider when as low speed would be when the car rolls or when it pitches. So I would use quite stiff damping there, significantly above the critical damping factor. And then high speed, something maybe above 75 millimeters per inch, to tune the ride characteristics of the car going over bumps and going over curbs. These would be higher speed motions above 75 millimeters per inch. And with that being relatively softer, it would allow the car to have more compliance over bumps and curbs. And particularly, say, as you entered a corner, you come off the brakes and the car would pitch more slowly, so you didn't get such a dramatic change of balance. And then also as you turned in, instead of just sort of flopping over on the spring, the high amount of low-speed damping would allow the car to just roll gently into the corner. So we would work with our characteristics that we would like to see in the damper, and we would work with Showa to achieve those damping characteristics. Yeah, there's 3 master cylinders there, one for the clutch and one for the front brakes and one for the rear brakes.
Something else you might want to look at is the steering column, which obviously had to clear the driver's toes when with the brake pedal being right in the middle, and we decided to offset the pinion just so that it gave enough access for the mechanics to get their hands in. Otherwise, it would have been on the centre line, and we didn't want to make a bigger hole than we needed to for the access.
Let's talk about fuel capacity and the 150 litre limit. So the fuel cap is underneath this little cover. So the fuel cell is here. This is the way the fuel is filled. Normally, we'd have a quick release fastening on there. Because this car has been on test, this has got a sealed cap, but we'd have a push-turn aircraft fitting. So my job, well, let's say at the factory first. So how do we control the 150 litres exactly? And we needed every last drop of fuel. So the fuel bag, by design, would hold 154, and then we had to size it down to 150 litres for each race. So at the factory, we would alter the fuel capacity by dropping in plastic balls, and we'd measure at the factory to make sure it didn't exceed 150 litres. My job at the race, one of my jobs on the grid, my last job on the grid, was the car would have 150 litres or 149.5 as it left the garage, but of course it's using a little bit of fuel to get to the grid. So when it came to the grid and stop, my job was I had a 5-foot tall tube with a big tank on the top with another 5 litres, and I would have to stand on top of the monocoque and release the cap and put the last drop of fuel in to brimful it with a little bit of pressure. That was how and every race we won, we had to take the fuel cell open, we had to dry all the fuel out, completely dry, and then the FIA would watch as we measured the fuel in, and generally we were always under 150 litres.
Here we have part of the fuel system, in the tank, part of the fuel system. Now, the bits and pieces are different for the MP4-4, but the concept is the same as the previous couple of cars. We had a similar system in the MP4-3 and even the last of the MP4-2s. We had a problem towards the end of 1986 with the TAG turbo engine, and the cars we were struggling to finish the races because we'd get fuel vaporization. And this was because the fuel was getting heated as it passed through the engine compartment. The way Porsche had done the fuel system, they supply excess fuel so that the engine would never run out. But that excess fuel was routed through the engine compartment, so it was heating up and evaporating. The fuel was actually boiling in the fuel tank. So what we did, because we had this mechanical collector with little one-way valves that would collect the fuel in the collector, and then there was a fuel line that goes to the bottom of the collector, to the top of the fuel tank, and then all the way to the back of the mechanical fuel pump that was on the back of the engine. So the engine's trying to suck, up to the top of the tank and then all the way to the back. And pumps don't like to suck, really. They like to have a little bit of positive pressure. So we replaced all that mechanical device with 3 simple little electric fuel pumps that would collect the fuel from the back of the fuel tank under acceleration, and then the hoses from those electric pumps would feed into this little collector, which was attached to the bottom of the fuel hatch, which is how you'd put the bag tank in. And on the original tank that we did on the MP4-2, it was all done in kind of a rush, and we homemade our little pressure relief valve. We only wanted about a half a bar pressure inside this little collectors because we didn't want to blow it up. So we'd made a little pop-off valve out of a tiny little ball bearing and a spring out of a ballpoint pen. And then we did trial and error until we got about a half a bar pressure. So that gave pressure to the fuel pump and eliminated the fuel vaporization. Porsche had also changed their fuel system so that the excess fuel was dumped back in the tank before it was routed through the engine compartment, which reduced the temperature quite a lot. And between those two things, it solved that fuel vaporization problem. And that concept was carried through from the MP4-2 to the 3 to the 4.
Okay, let's talk about the cockpit, if I can remember all the controls, a long time ago. So, steering wheel, we've got a radio button and a boost button, an overtake button. That's all on the steering wheel. We have a manual gear lever. So it's got a 6-speed gearbox. Means that they've got to, when they downshift, they've got to blip the throttle. This is not a seamless shift box like they have now. So clutch and manual gear shift. Let's talk on this side. So we've got ignition switch and pumps. So these are in-tank pumps. That pushes the fuel from the bottom of the tank up to the collector pot. Ignition on and off. We've got boost control, which they get a readout on the dash, how much boost pressure, radio on-off button. These switches here, this here is for the dampers. We had Showa dampers on this car, and quite advanced. Showa were part of Honda, and these dampers, front and rear, were adjustable. This is oil pressure warning light and fuel warning light. fire extinguisher button. So fire extinguisher, which provides fire extinguisher gas to the driver, and also has a pipe that goes to the engine. This is not the original bottle. The original bottle was made by McLaren's. It's shaped to clear the back of the driver's legs, and we had the bottles filled, but that bottle is not a recognised safety bottle now, and also you can't get them refilled. So this is a proprietary current bottle. Light, so this is the rain light, which is a FIA regulation. All drivers have to put it on when there's a visibility problem. Of course, you've got a removable steering wheel, which has a flexible cable connection. And then you have the front adjustable roll bar. So this operates a blade in there, which Steve was talking about, and you can see the blade.
Give him a wiggle. Yep, I get you.
Right.
I get you.
This one here, brake blast adjuster. So F and R, front and rear. So you've got two master cylinders, one for the front brakes, one for the rear brakes, and you've got a screw adjuster, so you can adjust how much brake you have on the front and how much on the rear. Same as on a modern Formula One car, but they've got a more computer-controlled lever. This is a simple, if you look down there, you can see this is to protect the driver's elbows from getting bruised on the tub when he's working the steering wheel. This was a mechanic's trim piece. I remember doing these. That's it. That's the cop.
So moving on to seat belts, the drivers for the shoulder straps had two option locations, a high and a low, which were held by these NAS bolts, as you can see, and were quick to change between drivers. But just as an indication of the lengths we went to keep the weight of absolutely everything to the minimum, there's these lovely little machined aluminium brackets, which are designed to locate the lap straps and the crotch straps in a way that allows it to be efficient and light. And looking at them now, again after all these years, it reminds me of just the level of detail that we went into for even the smallest of parts. Whilst we're talking about how things bolt to the chassis, it's interesting to note that everywhere where you can see one of these bolts, there is in effect a solid carbon insert between the skins. The manufacturing of the tub, there's an inner skin, there's honeycomb, and there's an outer skin, and typically that main shell would be it's about 10 millimeters or so thick, perhaps a little bit more, but with aluminium honeycomb as the sandwich. But of course, when you bolt something through aluminium honeycomb and then do the bolt up, it would crush unless you have something solid to prevent that crush in the honeycomb. So when you're designing the chassis, everywhere where you have a bolt, you have to have a solid insert. And it's usually a disc like this of the correct thickness, because the aluminium honeycomb changes thickness depending on where it is in the monocoque. So each of those bolts has to, when they're laying up a chassis, and this is another reason why the car was late, is because to be able to lay up the chassis, they of course have to know where every insert has to go. And for us to know where every insert has to go, the whole car has to be designed at a high enough level of detail that you know exactly where all the bolts need to go.
Well, you know, the cockpit on these cars is inevitably a pretty tight squeeze, and Prost had been with us for a while, and we were designing this part of the car around him, and when Senna arrived, it's quite a tight squeeze, and he said, "Oh, I've been working out in Brazil, you know, and upper body strength and all that," and he was really tight on his shoulders, and I said, maybe you could stop now.
Stop with the exercise.
with the exercise, because it was
really,
right?
Over
the
sides.
It was a tight squeeze.
So when we first had Alan sitting in the car a few days before the Imola test, there was a problem which we managed to solve, but it was an issue for him which actually probably lasted the whole season. But we mentioned that there are these vertical bulkheads inside the monocoque, And to get around the dampers, they actually had to, from the pedal box area, taper in slightly before they then tapered out again. And of course, the driver's feet being on the axle line meant that the width across the driver's feet was such that when they backed off either the throttle or the brake, with the taper of the vertical panels, the driver's feet would tend to come in, so the point they'd bring their toes closer together. So this was a particular problem for Alan, who, because he was sitting slightly further back, meant that his feet were in a slightly narrower section where the vertical panels were interfering more with the size of his feet. So as he was on and off the throttle, for example, his foot would actually rotate slightly inboard. And that was an issue for him, which we eventually corrected on the MP4-5, but for the full 4, he was kind of stuck with it, unfortunately. Didn't seem to put him off too much in terms of his performance there.
Towards the end of the life of the MP4-4, Neil Oatley and his team had started work on the normally aspirated cars. So here we have a Honda V10 engine, which we've attached to the back of a modified MP4-4 chassis. So the chassis is very much the same, all the forward part, but it's been shortened to make room for the V10 engine. And then you can see it's been expanded sideways, kind of like a pannier thing there to increase the fuel volume. So yeah, this was kind of a mule car to test towards the end of the life of the MP4-4. And it, you know, for kind of a Heath Robinson sort of car, it worked really well. You know, the handling was nice, the engine worked well, and so it was a good tool for developing what eventually became the MP4-5. So yeah, Neil and his team were working on this while we were still finishing off with racing the MP4-4.
In 1989, the Neil Oatley designed MP4-5 followed to take the title, albeit not in quite so dominant a fashion as its predecessor. It did this again in 1990, and the MP4-6 followed up with another title for 1991. 6 MP4-4 chassis were built, and unusually for a race car, all of them survive today. By now, you're familiar with number 3, the only car ever to never win a race, and the main test car for the season. Number 2 was victorious for both Prost and Senna. Today, these are both in private hands, and we are grateful to their anonymous but generous owners for allowing the filming to take place. Chassis number 1 was competed by both drivers, and won for Senna at Imola. He also raced it in Mexico and Monaco. Prost used it at Hungary, Spa and Monza. It is now owned by McLaren. Chassis number 4 was used only by Prost, and taken to victory 3 times, at Monaco, Mexico and Paul Ricard. He also drove it at San Marino, Canada, Detroit and Silverstone. It is now in private ownership. Chassis number 5 was only used by Senna, who won 4 times, Silverstone, Hockenheim, Hungary and Spa. He also raced it at Monza. It is owned by Honda and occasionally demonstrated. I believe it is this car seen in the videos provided by DecayF on YouTube, reused here kindly with their permission. Chassis 6 is also owned by McLaren and was just used by Prost, who won at Estoril, Jerez and Adelaide. McLaren were already a winning team before the arrival of the MP4-4 and remained so for a long time after. Having now had the good fortune to spend so much time with just a few of the people behind the car, I have become fascinated with its story, and if you've got this far in the video, I'm sure you feel the same way. So I think it only fair that to end this video, I hand you back over to them.
Yeah, I don't know. The old girl looks pretty good to me all these years later. I suppose I'm prejudiced, but it's just lovely, really. The aesthetics of it, it looks nice with the bodywork on and, you know, seeing all the beautiful work underneath. You know, the efforts of the designers, the efforts of the fabricators, the efforts of the laminators, you know, to make all these components. And you know, look at all these pieces. It's just mechanical art, you know, and it's fantastic. And speaking to the design process, you know, I was really privileged to be given the opportunity to do this. You know, working at a major Formula One team with a major budget, and working with such a talented group of engineers. You know, we'd worked together for a few years, and I don't know, it was beyond team. It was almost more like family, and you know, we liked each other. We worked well together. We respected each other. we discussed things, and we all moved forward in the same direction. So it was a fantastic thing to create this, and it was a fantastic thing to see it be built by the other talented people who made it all, who did the laminating and the welding and the fabricating and the machining and the mechanics that screwed it together, and everybody that did such a fantastic job. I remember once in a conversation with Rick Goodhand, one of the mechanics, he said we knew that the design was fantastic and we knew that the drivers were fantastic, and that if anything was going to screw it up, it was us, the mechanics, that were going to let the side down. So he said we made absolutely sure that we were doing everything as perfect as we could. And hence you get this reliability, and 15 out of 16 races, 10 1-2s. It's just the ultimate expression of the advantage of teamwork. And that's the main memory I take away from it all, is working with all those people in that fantastic sort of family atmosphere. All the time at McLaren you'd be there, you're on salary, so you're not getting paid for, but all these people would be in on a Saturday morning. Not getting paid, but there was just nowhere else they'd rather be.
I just remember it being a really intense period, between August '87 and when the car had to first run. And as that time got nearer and nearer, we were under more and more pressure to obviously do the best job we could, but just to get it made, give everybody enough time to get it made was one thing. The fact that it went to Imola and that phone call back to say, it's within 5 laps, it's 2 seconds quicker than anybody's gone previously. It was just absolutely incredible. Yeah. There's a perfect storm of, Ron putting together that team, JB having taught us what he knew, and we sort of continued with a lot of his philosophies. All the people that really, as you say, Steve, pulled together as a team, and were just interested in, contributing to the McLaren family as we were.
It was kind of, I guess, looking back on it now, it was kind of a leap of faith on Ron's part to put us in charge of doing this. At the time, I felt that it was the culmination of all the experience of McLaren over the years coming together in this, the best that we could think of.
For me, I have to say, it's been a fantastic day to see this car in beautiful condition, beautifully restored, a full running car, and to be here as Chris's guest and to do this YouTube presentation. I think it's been a great experience. Yeah, absolutely. We could talk for hours and hours, couldn't we? But for me, I'd left the team in '81 to set up my own F3 team, and I knew Senna when he was coming up through Formula 3. So when I came back to work for Ron in '85 to do the new factory, and then I was on the team in '87 with Prost and Stefan, I was coming back in to race him. But when '88 came round and I knew that Ayrton was coming on board with LA, and Ron asked me to be chief mechanic, I was so thrilled to be able to, I'd worked a year with Alain, with the tag engine, but I was thrilled to be with Ayrton as well. And what a year, 2 years, because the year after was good. So I sat down with Ron when he asked me to be chief mechanic, and he agreed my salary, and I said, and prize money, and he said, well, hang on, he said, we might have a very good year. And I said, well, we might have a bad year. So he said, okay, same as the mechanics, £50 a point. End of '88, I came home with £10,000 prize money, and probably the best year of racing that I've had since 1968. In fact, the year after, we had equally good success, and for me, that was the way of going out back into a job in the factory to finish trackside with this car and the subsequent car. And also, got to mention Honda what a great job they did. I know the engine had been fully developed, but they were full on.
I think everybody probably says they whatever they're doing or whatever stage of their career they're in, you know, they do something special and it's, you know, it's special to them. But we truly were in a golden era of Formula One.
Everything, you know, to win a championship, everything's got to come together in the year. Your drivers, tyres, chassis, engine, everything, reliability as well. Our guys, my guys and my team, can't say my guys, the guys I work with, every detail, every fixing, every nut and bolt and torque check. And they do the same now, but yeah, for me, it was a magic year.